Thank you, Your Honor. Then we would call Genevieve Hansen to the stand.
Just to stand behind the chair?
Okay.
No, come on. Raise your right hand. You swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth? Stand behind the chair. Okay. No, come on. See? Raise your right hand. And I think to be able to hear more clearly, if you are comfortable in doing so, I'd ask that you remove the mask. And let's begin by you giving your full name, spelling each of your names, please.
My name is Genevieve Hansen, Genevieve. Last name Hansen, Hansen.
Thank you. Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Hansen, what's your current occupation? What do you do?
I'm a firefighter for Minneapolis.
That
City.
explains the uniform you're wearing today.
Correct, sir.
And how long have you been a firefighter for the city of Minneapolis?
Just about 2 years now.
And so, not a question I often like to ask women, but how old are you?
27.
Okay. There's a reason we ask that. The jury will figure that out later.
Okay.
So for about 2 years now, you've been a firefighter. And can you describe for the jurors, what you had to do to become a firefighter for the city of Minneapolis?
There's a hiring process, and once you're hired, we go through an EMT training. I am certified for the state and a national license. And then you go forward with firefighter licenses. That's a 4-month academy.
And so tell us, even before starting as a firefighter, did you have to learn some first aid type?
Yeah, it wasn't necessary to get on the job, but I had gone through an EMT program already, so I've gone through the course twice.
So when did you first do the EMT program?
I think it was sometime in 2017.
And so what was that program? How long was that?
It's called Pathways Academy, and it was a summer. It was just the majority of the summer. I went to a fire station and did my course.
And so do you remember how long that was? Was that 4 months, did you say?
Maybe about that. It wasn't every day, so it depends on which one you do.
And so what kinds of things did you do during your work at Pathways Academy?
We did a lot. The Pathways Academy is longer than your typical EMT training because it really wants to give a chance to people to pass it. It's quite a difficult test. So we did a lot of hands-on training and book work.
And so the book work, what kinds of books, what are you learning in that?
Probably more than you do need to know about the anatomy and different bones and the way your heart works, and then down to basic life-saving things that we need to know for my job, or if you wanted to move forward with paramedics. I could go on.
So you have some classroom.
Correct.
And do you remember how long the classroom instruction was?
A day.
Okay.
I think it was like an 8-hour day or something.
And then you have some more hands-on training?
That was throughout the day. And we had homework. We did homework all night, every night for the whole time.
So how long was the Pathways Academy program altogether?
I think it was probably about 3 months or so. I can check, but.
So then after you have a day of classroom, what do you spend the rest of the time doing?
Studying.
What's that?
Studying.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so for then, there's some.
We did quite a few ride-alongs as well with, I did a couple of ride-alongs with paramedics and with fire.
So is this Pathways Academy affiliated with the fire department?
It's, I believe it's through the city of Minneapolis, just for trying to reach out to city youth within the city.
So is this a way of helping you get a job as a firefighter?
Yes.
Okay. And so then during that time, you're doing some ride-alongs, you're actually working with the fire department?
I actually had a cardiac arrest, our first call on my first ride-along. It's quite the sight.
And that was before you were even hired as a firefighter?
Before I was hired as a firefighter, before I was an EMT.
And so then, after Pathways Academy, did you have to take a test of some kind?
Yes, that's when I got my national registry
Okay.
test finished.
And, describe for you, excuse me, if you would, describe for the jury what that test is like. How long is it?
Yeah. You go through a hands-on portion and a written portion, just to demonstrate that you're prepared for any life-saving measures you need to take, or splinting, or kind of covers all of that. And then the test is really scenario-based, like what are the first things you need to look at? What are the most important things that you need to address to have the best outcome for the patient?
So is it written or is it?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
Both.
You mean the written part, or it's fill in the blank.
And then, right, so
Yeah.
it's some like written part, but is there also like showing how to do certain procedures?
Right, that's what I was explaining before. It's the hands-on portion.
Right, hands-on, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say both, it's a written test kind of, and as well as hands-on.
Separate days, yep.
And so you took that test at the end of the Pathways Academy program?
Yep. And at the end of, or in the middle of my academy for the fire department.
Okay. And so did you pass?
Yes.
And so then you obtain a certification?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes, sir.
And what is the certification for? What does that mean you are?
I can, there's a range of things that I can do for, our role a lot of times is to assist the medics, or we get there before the medics, and so we can, start any basic wound bandaging, or up to, starting compressions for full working CPR right away.
Does it also involve assessing a patient to determine what is needed?
Correct, that's the first thing we would do.
Okay. And then, so you're certified as an EMT, and I guess just for the record, what does EMT stand for?
Emergency medical technician.
And you got a national certification for that?
Yep, and a state.
And is that separate testing, or how does that work to get national and state?
I believe it is separate testing, and then you have, we have continuous hours of education that for both.
And so, since your certification, you've had to continue taking classes to maintain the certification?
Yep, the fire department does continuing education all year round.
So then you, when you finished Pathways Academy, had you already been hired by the fire department, or did that come after?
That came after, about a year after I started the process.
And then once you got hired, is that when you obtained the state certification then?
I think I had both all along. The Pathways is why I have both.
Okay. So as part of this certification, you are able to do what we think of as CPR.
Right.
And that's, well, explain for the jurors what CPR is when we use that term.
So if we find no pulse, I would ask for medical, calling 911. I'd want an AED on scene, and I would start compressions. If I had my med bag, I would also be giving breaths. But if I didn't, I'm just a rate of 100 compressions a minute.
And so CPR is the process of trying to resuscitate somebody, if I'm
Yeah, we're looking to regain a heart rhythm.
And heart rhythm is another way of saying a pulse, essentially.
Correct.
Okay. You can tell I have not been through
Sorry.
the training you have, right? And so I just want to make sure, that you know more about this than we do, so that's why I'm trying to just fill in these terms.
Yeah.
Okay, and, incidentally, before Pathways Academy, had you received some training in like CPR before that even?
Yeah, I did Red Cross babysitting.
Work as a lifeguard ever?
Yes, I was a lifeguard.
Okay.
Yep.
So you got to know that kind of stuff then, too.
Yeah, yep.
And that was,
I did that quite a few times in my youth.
We need to wait till he's done with the questions so that we don't have people talking over each other.
I'm sorry, say it again?
Let's make sure we don't talk over each other.
Oh, sorry, I didn't
It
know.
makes it really hard to have a good record, so,
Got
all right.
yeah, the court reporter has to take down everything we're saying, so we got to each wait to answer,
Yeah.
or wait for the question to be done. And I'll try to be better about that too. So, so when you start working for the fire department, explain if you would for the jury, when you go in for your shift, who are your coworkers, not, who they are, but like how many people are at a fire station during a shift and how are they divided up?
Yeah. It depends on if you're at a single house or a double house, meaning is there just an engine there or is there an engine and a ladder? And on the engine we have 3 to 4, and on the truck we ride 4. So maybe 8 in a house, and if there's a chief there or not, we're all EMTs.
And so, as a firefighter, you mentioned earlier, I think, receiving separate training on fighting fires, right? I mean, that makes sense, right?
Very different jobs.
Yeah. And so in your 2 years as a firefighter, have you gone to fires?
Yeah, quite a few for somebody with as much time on as I have.
And have you, had to enter buildings that are on fire
Yes, sir.
and provide, I guess, rescue for people who are in a building that's on fire?
Yes, I have pulled victims out of buildings.
And when you do that as a unit of 4 or however many other firefighters are there, you all work together on those types of calls.
Correct.
When you're, in your work as a firefighter, the title obviously makes us all think that you fight fires. But you do a lot more than that, correct? You have to say yes or no.
Yeah.
Thing to remember is the court reporter has to take it all down. So
Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, we don't often get a fire. I would say, I've heard quite a few people give like a 90% medical for the calls, and that also depends on which station and which part of the city you're serving.
So, whatever the specific number is, it's the great majority of your cases are medical, not fire.
Right.
And in those medical calls that you've been on since you started working as a firefighter in Minneapolis, have there been times when you have had to provide resuscitation to someone who was pulseless?
Many times.
Have there been times when you have been on a call and you have had to assess a patient's condition and what they might need?
Many times. Majority of the time, we arrive before the paramedics, just based on how many fire stations there are in the city, and that's why we respond to medical calls, so we can assist them and or be there if they can't be immediately.
So incidentally, you've talked about, working at the fire station, your shift. Is it a regular 9 to 5 job? how are your shifts done?
Personally, my shifts are 48 hours. So there's also the option of working 24 hours at a time. But I'm at the fire station for 48 hours. And calls in the middle of the night.
And then
Even.
you get a weekend or something? Or how?
I have 4 days off then after that. Mm-hmm.
So when you're, in your experience,
Mm-hmm.
how many times per shift would you say you have a medical call involving an unconscious or pulseless person?
It really depends on which station you're at. I'm at a particularly busy station, so it could be anywhere from, for pulseless, I'm in an area where there's a lot of overdosing, so anywhere from 1 to 5 times in a 24-hour period.
So dealing with a person who does not have a pulse is fairly common.
Yeah, correct.
I want to draw your attention to May 25th of 2020. So at that point, you had been working as a firefighter for a little over a year?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, yes?
Yes, sir.
And were you in the area of Cup Foods at 38th and Chicago?
Yes, sir.
And were you working that day?
No.
And, without telling us where you live, do you live in that area?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm in walking distance of that area.
Okay. And so on that date, in the early evening, just what were you out doing that you found yourself in that area?
I was just going for a walk. I believe I worked the day before. So a lot of times you're just kind of tired, and I just wanted to sort of have a peaceful day. So I went on a walk, and I sat in a little community garden on 38th for a while. And just thought it would be getting kind of dark soon, so I decided to take Chicago home rather than go through neighborhood streets.
Do you remember, were you on foot or in your car?
I was on foot.
And so you approached Cup Foods on Chicago?
Yes, sir.
And as you were approaching that area, did something catch your attention?
Mm-hmm. It's not uncommon to see, lights and think that, oh, my coworkers are there. So from a distance, I figured, it could have been anything. But I figured that fire was there, so I started walking that direction. And as I got closer, there was a woman across the street screaming that they were killing him. So that's when I was alerted that the situation wasn't a basic medical call.
So at some point, did you walk to the area where this woman was?
Yes, I actually asked her what was going on.
And then from there, did you notice some police cars in the area?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
And did you then walk over to that area where the police cars were?
I walked.
Police car.
Yeah, I walked kind of in a big circle around the scene just to sort of start to have an idea what was actually going on.
And so you approached this police car where the incident was taking place?
Yeah, I came from behind the officers.
And I'm going to show you Exhibit 1 on the screen.
Okay.
It should come up on the screen right in front of you.
Okay.
Yes, sir. This has been admitted already. Do you see the photograph of Exhibit 1 in front of you?
Yes.
And you recognize this as the intersection of 38th and Chicago?
Yes.
And you'll notice in front of you there should be a little stylus like this. and you can actually draw on the screen with that.
Okay.
And I'd ask you just to kind of draw on there for the jury, you know, your approach to this area and where you went until you went over by the squad car.
Okay. So the garden was on this side of the street. I'm not sure if I walked across or straight, but the woman that I first asked what was going on was just about here. So I made my way around, and I believe I came all the way around this way, and I was kind of watching what was going on here, and then I made my way around.
And then just for the benefit of the record, you're drawing that you were going westbound on 38th and then crossed over to the Dragon Walk side of 38th. That's where you crossed Chicago, then crossed 38th to near the Speedway store, and from there crossed over to the Cup Food side of Chicago.
Yes, sir.
All right. And Your Honor, can you erase that all in one fell swoop? And then, so when you crossed from the Speedway side of the store, well, let me do it this way. No, I'll back up. Why did you bother to walk then from the Speedway side of the store over to the Cup Food side of the store?
Because I was concerned to see a handcuffed man who was not moving with officers with their whole body weight on his back, and a crowd that was stressed out.
And so we have, we have previously admitted Exhibit 11. And this is a video taken from a camera across the street. And I'm going to show you a shortened version of Exhibit 11.
Mm-hmm.
All right? Is that yes?
Yes.
All right. And for the record, we are starting this at 8:25:20 approximately. So do you see that video on the screen?
Yes.
All right. And does this look like, you know, the area that we were talking about where you went and approached this
Yes.
scene that you described? All right. Now, I'm going to pause it right here.
Yes.
And looking at this, do you see this person I'm circling here?
It's myself.
Okay. And if everybody was seeing you approach from down here, correct? You came this way. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
All right. So you came from the bottom of the screen to this area, and you seem to be holding something in your hand. Do you recall what you were holding?
I didn't have anything but my phone, I believe. Or my keys.
And so what I'd like to do is let this run to show where you were during this incident, all right? So just keeping an eye on where you are
Okay.
and how you remained at the scene, all right?
Okay.
Okay. Now, if we can pause it right here, and just for the record, it's at 8:26:29. We saw the camera moved a little bit, correct?
Mhm. Yes,
And so for a moment there, you were just off screen, correct?
correct.
And up until that point, you had essentially remained on the sidewalk, correct?
Correct.
And so at that point, you stepped off the curb. How far from the curb did you go while you were off the screen?
I don't remember.
Okay, you didn't leave the area.
No.
And at that moment, you go back up onto the sidewalk. Do you remember why you went back up onto the sidewalk?
Because the officer controlling the scene was requesting that we stay on the sidewalk, demanding we stay on the sidewalk.
And if you could just take the stylus and circle the officer that you're saying demanded you stay on the sidewalk. And for the record, Your Honor, the witness is drawing a circle around Officer Tao. And so when he asked you to go back up on the sidewalk, you did.
Yes, sir.
And at some point, you started a video recording with your phone, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so we've already dealt with that, but at some point here, you actually start recording, correct?
Correct.
All right. So you continue. And Ms. Hanson, I'm sorry, I'm going to hold off on another question for now. I'm going to ask that the video be paused here for the record at 8:30:25, 26 to be more precise. The video has shown that the ambulance has left with Mr. Floyd, and you're still standing there on the sidewalk, correct?
Correct.
So during that time period, after you first arrived, went up on the sidewalk, there was just that one time that you left the sidewalk and went out into the street, correct?
Correct.
All right. When you first walked up and you told the jury about coming around and crossing Chicago and approaching, when you first walked up, did you observe the officers that were on top of the individual on the ground?
Yes.
Did you know any of those officers or recognize any of them?
Once I was all the way around, I recognized their Chauvin's face.
Okay. And where did you recognize it from?
It was a call probably the day before, or I believe it was the shift I had just worked.
But did you know him at all?
No, sir.
Did you talk to him on that previous call? Or?
No, sir. I just noticed him because I had observed him on that previous call.
Did you know his name at that point in time?
No, sir.
All right. So what did you see about the officers there in relation to the body on the ground?
I noticed leaning, the officers were leaning over his body it appeared to be the majority of their weight on Mr. Floyd.
And so how many officers did you see over Mr. Floyd?
In my memory, for whatever reason, I remember seeing 4 on his body, and we know now that was 3.
So when you first walked up, you came around from that side, but then you had to go around to the other side onto the curb, other side of the squad car, correct?
Correct.
All right. And when you saw that positioning of those officers, did that concern you?
Absolutely.
Why?
He wasn't moving, and he was cuffed, and that's 3 grown men is a lot. Of putting all their weight on somebody is too much.
And did you notice where this officer you now know to be Mr. Chauvin, where he was putting his weight on Mr. Floyd?
His neck.
And incidentally, did you know the person laying on the ground, prone on the ground, who was handcuffed?
No, sir.
Okay. You subsequently learned his identity.
Correct.
All right. And that individual on the ground under the officers, could you tell if he was moving at all?
He was not moving. His face was. The first thing that concerned me is his face was like smushed into the ground, appearing swollen to me.
And at that point, are you acting a little bit as Genevieve Hansen, EMT?
I identified myself right away because I noticed that he needed medical attention. It didn't take me long to realize that he had an altered level of consciousness, and in our training, that is when the first sign that somebody needs medical attention. So my attention moved from Mr. Floyd to how can I gain access to this patient and give him medical attention or direct the officers. And I didn't pay much attention to George Floyd after that.
So when you first got there and you saw Mr. Floyd on the ground, you mentioned about seeing his face, correct?
Correct.
And incidentally, I think in a subsequent interview you had talked about Mr. Floyd's face facing towards the speedway, correct?
Correct.
And you,
Which is just what my memory did, but we know that's not right.
And now as you sit here today, do you remember seeing his face when you were around to the squad car side of him?
Yes, sir.
And so, in terms of, his face when you're first there, or even the rest of him, what is it that you saw that made you concerned about his medical needs?
I was really concerned about, I thought his face looked puffy and swollen, which would happen if you were putting a grown man's weight on someone's neck. I noticed some fluid coming from what looked like George Floyd's body, and in a lot of cases we see a patient release their bladder when they die. I can't tell you exactly where the fluid was coming from, but that's where my mind went. He wasn't moving. He was being restrained, but he wasn't moving.
When you first arrived, was he vocalizing at all? Was he speaking at all?
I don't remember.
And earlier you used the term altered consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
And what do you mean by that? What did you see in terms of his consciousness?
Well, we, when we're assessing on a level of consciousness on a call, we'll often first try to just talk to the patient and see if they respond. And if we don't get a response, we'll often kind of tap them on the shoulder or apply sort of painful stimuli. And often I would do a sternal rub or, press their fingernail very hard. And if they respond to that, we know that, we can assess their level of consciousness based on that. When somebody's laying on your, or leaning into your neck, that's painful stimuli. So I could tell that from the sidewalk.
Tell what?
That he had an altered level of consciousness to the point that he wasn't responding to painful stimuli.
You mentioned that Mr. Chauvin had a knee on Mr. Floyd's neck.
Correct.
Did you see where his other leg was?
I don't remember anymore, but I think I may have said something about it in previous.
Did you think it was on Mr. Floyd's back?
I don't know.
Okay. And in that moment, when you first arrived and observed what you could about Mr. Floyd, what did you think you needed to do?
I think I had already assessed that he had an altered level of consciousness. What I needed to know is whether or not he had a pulse anymore.
And, I may back you up just a little bit here, but did you try and assess, how much weight Mr. Chauvin was putting on George Floyd?
I mean, I didn't try to. I recognized that it was an issue right away because he seemed very comfortable. With
Who's he?
Officer Chauvin.
Okay.
Seemed very comfortable with the majority of his weight balanced on top of Mr. Floyd's neck. In my memory, he had his hand in his pocket. He looked so comfortable.
And if his hand wasn't actually in his pocket, would that change anything that you assessed at the time?
I suppose not. He was comfortable in the position that he was in.
So if his hand, instead of being in his pocket, was simply resting on his thigh, would that change any of your assessment?
He wasn't distributing the weight out and on the car, on the pavement.
When you first approached, you said you identified yourself as a firefighter.
Correct.
To whom did you identify yourself?
To Officer Tao, controlling the scene. I spoke loudly enough that I would think that the other three officers would have been able to hear me throughout the event.
We know you weren't, well, let me ask you this way. How did Officer Tao respond?
He said something along the lines of, if you really are a Minneapolis firefighter, you would know better than to get involved.
What did you think of that?
First, I was worried that he wasn't going to believe me and not let me help. And I also, that's not right. I mean, that's exactly what I should have done. There was no medical assistance on scene, and I got there, and I could have given medical assistance. That's exactly what I should have done.
So based on your training and experience and what you had seen, what did you want to do for this person on the ground?
Had they let me into the scene, I already had decided what his level of consciousness was, so I would have requested additional help. I would have wanted someone to call 911 for the paramedics and fire to come. I would have asked someone to run to the gas station and look for an AED. And I would have checked his airway. I would have been worried about a spinal cord injury because he had so much weight on his neck. I would have opened his airway to check if there were any obstructions. And I would have checked for a pulse. And when I didn't find a pulse, if that was the case, I would have started compressions. And I didn't have my bed bag, so I would have continued compressions. We don't give mouth to mouth anymore. So I would have continued compressions at a rate of 100 a minute until help arrived.
And by compressions, what do you mean?
I would have put my hands, stacked my hands and pressed his chest.
Chest compressions.
Chest compressions,
Yep.
correct, yeah.
And what's the point of doing chest compressions?
Pumping the blood for somebody that's not doing that themselves, trying to get a pulse back.
And were you able to do that, any of those steps?
No, sir.
Why weren't you able to do any of that?
Because the officers didn't let me into the scene. I also offered, in my memory, to walk them through it, or told them, if he doesn't have a pulse, you need to start compressions, and that wasn't done either.
And so are these things that you wanted to do?
It's what I would have done for anybody.
And when you couldn't do that, how did that make you feel?
Totally distressed.
Were you frustrated?
Yes.
Ms. Hanson, as I told you, we can take our time, so feel free to just take a minute. And need a drink of water, go ahead.
Okay.
While you were there, were there other people around you on the sidewalk?
Yes.
And were they saying things to the officers as well?
Yes.
And do you remember what kinds of things they were saying?
No, I was pretty focused on trying to get the officers to let me help.
And how were you doing that, trying to get the officers to focus on you and get help?
I think in my memory, I tried different tactics of calm and reasoning. I tried to be assertive. I pled and was desperate.
Did you also at some point start raising your voice?
Yes, sir.
And maybe used some foul language even?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Because I was desperate to help, and I wasn't getting what I needed to do and gaining access.
And at some point, the voices of the other people around you, did you feel that sort of interfered with getting the officer's attention?
Yes.
So as you're doing that, were you able to pay more attention or any more attention to Mr. Floyd and his condition?
I wasn't really able to. I knew he needed help, so at that point it was just getting in there.
When you asked the officers to take his pulse, did you ever see them doing that?
No.
When you were over on the sidewalk at Officer Tao's direction, were you able to see the other two officers on Mr. Floyd?
From my memory, just kind of their heads.
So if at some point they may have checked a pulse, you may not have seen that either.
Correct.
All right. During this time, did you make any observations or notes about Mr. Floyd's characteristics of his breathing? That was a terrible question. Do you want me to start over?
Yes.
Okay. During the incident, when you were there, did you make some observations of sort of the characteristics of Mr. Floyd's breathing that concerned you?
I don't remember anymore.
Okay. What is meant by the term agonal breathing or agonal breaths?
Agonal gasps we see in patients that are dying or pretty much dead. It's just kind of the body's. Forgive me, I don't quite know, but it's a sign of death.
And have you seen that in other calls when you've been working?
Yes.
And did you see something similar in Mr. Floyd?
I don't remember anymore, but I don't know.
Okay. So during that time period, he did not regain consciousness that you saw,
No.
and you stayed with him, or I'm sorry, you were there the entire time until he was loaded into the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
And at some point, you made, well, I guess the question is this. You didn't pay close attention to Mr. Floyd at some point because you knew he was unconscious.
Needing medical attention, there was no question.
And based on that, you focused more on trying to get the officers to allow you to help.
Correct.
And at some point, did you start video recording
Yeah.
your interaction?
Yes.
And with your phone, I assume.
Yes.
And why did you do that?
I'm not sure why I chose to do it. It's an instinct.
And so you did record it,
Yes, sir.
and based on that, well, I guess I'll just ask it this way. At some point after the incident, you were interviewed by law enforcement officers.
The BCAs? Or?
Correct, yes.
Yes, sir.
And you made that video available to them, correct?
Correct.
And why did you think it was important to record that?
Because memories of witnesses are never going to be as good as a video.
And so you wanted to have it to preserve.
It wasn't conscious, but I'm sure that's why anybody takes a video.
Yeah. And bear with me a second while I
Okay.
try to read my own handwriting. After recording that video, you stopped recording at some point, correct?
I don't remember.
Well, obviously you did stop at some point, right?
Well, yeah.
And eventually the ambulance took Mr. Floyd away.
Right.
And then earlier I said we'd come back to that moment in the previous video in Exhibit 11 when the ambulance left and you were still standing on the sidewalk there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
And we saw you just standing there. What's going through your mind as you're standing there?
I'm not sure. I think I probably was in disbelief.
And kind of in shock?
Yes.
And what, and at some point then, did you also make a 911 call?
Yes.
And it had to be sort of, I think distressing was the word you had used before. Did you have, when you're there and you're trying to help and couldn't, did you have a feeling of helplessness?
Absolutely.
Were you upset about that?
Yes.
Did you feel that, whatever the end result, you could have tried to help?
Sustained.
Well, why did you feel helpless?
Because there was a man being killed, and I would have, had I had access to a call similar to that, I would have been able to provide medical attention to the best of my abilities, and this human was denied that right.
And so from that point, we saw you standing there on the sidewalk, just sort of standing still.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And from there, did you stay in the area for a little while?
Yes.
And at some point, you made a 911 call.
Yes.
Why at that point did you call 911?
I think it all settled in that I wish I would have done that immediately, because it was ridiculous that fire station 17 was as close as it was, and that they hadn't been there. I should have called 911 immediately, but I didn't. And when things calmed down, I realized that I wanted them to know what was going on. I wanted to basically report it.
And so you made that call, correct?
Correct.
And a little bit more than a minute long. At some point, they wanted to transfer you to a supervisor, correct?
Correct. I asked for that.
And but then the call ends.
Okay.
Do you remember why the call ended at that point?
I don't know exactly, but there was kind of a lot going on. I was still worried about the witnesses on scene, particularly because they were people of color and black men. I was worried about their safety, and there were officers still on scene. But also, fire came, and it may have been that I ended the call because my co-workers were there and I could tell them what was going on.
So tell us about that. So at some point when you're there at the scene still, did a fire truck come?
Yes.
And they're coming to respond to the call, correct?
They're coming to respond to the call, and they went into Cub Foods to actually look for a victim, which is unique for that, there to be that much miscommunication.
So let me ask you just a little different question. So when they came, those firefighters, did you know them?
I knew 2 of them.
And how many total came?
4.
And
Driver, 2 firefighters, and a captain.
So the two that you knew, how did you know them?
Crossing paths at work.
So they knew who you were.
Yes.
So you knew that members of the fire department knew you were on scene as well,
Yes.
but off duty, of course.
Yes.
And so you had a conversation with them while they were there at Cup Foods?
Yes.
And you also had some conversations with other people who had stuck around afterwards?
Yes. And the driver and the other firefighter that weren't in the ambulance came back, and I also spoke to them.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
May I have 1 minute to go through something?
You may.
Everyone can just stay on a stretch in place if you'd like.
Please.
Afternoon, Ms. Hanson.
Hi.
Just have some follow-up questions for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here with us today. You testified that you've been a firefighter now for 2 years approximately,
Correct.
and I see you're wearing your uniform today,
Correct.
and that would be like your dress uniform or your Class A uniform,
Correct.
and that's common to wear when you testify in court.
Correct.
Fair to say that you were not wearing your Class A or any uniform on May 25th, 2020?
Correct. I was off duty.
Okay. Being a firefighter is a stressful job.
Correct.
You testified about your experience as an EMT. We didn't talk much about your firefighter training.
Okay.
So you said you went through a 4-month academy, correct?
Correct.
And in that academy, I assume you learn like the basics of fire, right?
Correct.
Like different types of backdrafts and
Building
whatever.
construction.
Right. How to approach a fire, how to, where to aim the hose, I guess. More-
Yes, but fire is fire.
Right. So but sometimes you probably got to come from the top down or from the bottom up, right?
Different always.
Right. And you learn about like going into a burning building, right?
Right.
Being safe, being cautious.
Right.
It's again, part of what you have to learn is how to deal with the stress of being a firefighter.
Right.
Do you either in the academy or in your continuing training, do you have trainings that focus on how to deal with the physical reaction to stress?
We do go over that in our trainings throughout the continuing ed. Also, I think you're suited or not for the job.
Sure. Takes a certain type of person to do the job,
Right.
right? But breathing becomes important, right?
Right.
You put on an oxygen tank, a mask.
Yep.
You've got to know how to breathe properly.
Controlling your breathing, right.
And sometimes you may go into a situation, it's not totally on fire and you may not have your mask on. You're running upstairs to save someone's life. Again, controlling your breathing, right?
Right.
And you learn about, have you ever heard the term tunnel vision as a part of fire training?
Not necessarily as a part of fire training, but I know what tunnel vision is.
So when you're stressed, you kind of focus on
Yeah.
a particular thing,
Right.
right? And it kind of changes your peripheral vision and you become hyper-focused, right?
Right.
So you're familiar with that and you may have experienced that in the context of your firefighting.
Yes.
And obviously, and unfortunately, I'm assuming that sometimes you're not able to save everyone, right?
Correct.
And that there's a level of trauma that comes with that, right?
Sometimes.
Right. Depending on the circumstances.
Correct.
You also testified that you have both a national and state certification as an EMT, right?
Correct.
That stands for Emergency Medical Technician.
Correct.
And that's basic first responder stuff, right? Medical training for first responders.
I believe that there's more basic. I mean, I think the police officers are not emergency medical technicians.
Right. But then it's not as high as like a paramedic.
Correct.
Right? So a paramedic has even more training than an EMT.
Yes.
Right. And obviously, maybe the CPR you learned to become a lifeguard was less intensive than what it took to become an EMT, right?
I took it much more seriously because I was practicing it and using it, but it's the same.
Yeah. But in your EMT training, you also learn like tourniquets and splinting and
Right. Like I mentioned before.
yep, all of these sort of assessment and emergency first responsive care.
Yep.
Okay. And you testified that because you've only been a firefighter for 2 years, you've been in several burning buildings.
Correct.
Now, have you ever been in a burning building or outside? Let's say you're outside. Let me ask you a hypothetical question. You're outside of a burning building and you're spraying the hose on the fire, right? Has anyone ever tried to come up to you and say you're doing it wrong?
No.
Do you think that, has anyone ever stopped to film you when you're fighting a fire?
Yes.
Okay. So you see someone, you're fighting the fire,
Yeah.
and someone starts to film you. Does that, I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Try not to interrupt each other. Go ahead.
It's not conscious, but
Yeah, it's,
I know, it's not a normal conversation, so we get it.
we all started talking at one time. you know,
Okay.
So it's unusual, but I'm sorry, and I'll try to slow down too, right? So you're fighting a fire, right? And you may notice a citizen filming what you're doing.
correct.
And that would not necessarily interfere with your ability to fight a fire,
No.
right? Have you ever had a citizen start to yell at you while you're fighting a fire?
No.
Do you think it would make your job fighting the fire harder if someone started yelling at you and telling you that you were doing it wrong?
I'm very confident in the training that I've been given, so I would not be concerned about somebody that was not trained to the extent I have been, and I would continue to fight the fire the way I would.
Right. But do you think it would be distracting?
No.
What if there were 12 people yelling at you and telling you that you were doing it wrong?
I think a burning structure in a city where there are buildings and homes and people living on either side is much more concerning than 20 people trying to tell me to do something different.
Right. But you wouldn't be distracted by that at all?
No.
What if they started calling you names?
Like I said, I know my job, and I would be confident in doing my job, and there's nothing anybody could say that would distract me.
Okay. So, what if they started to physically threaten you?
I'll repeat myself because I'm confident in my job and what I do and what needs to be done and my training, so I would continue to do that.
What is staging? What does it mean when a fire department stages at an incident?
It's always different, but we can stage to wait for someone to assess what's exactly going on and how we need to tackle that particular call.
Okay. So let's assume there's a call and the police are on scene at the call, right? And they
Sorry to interrupt. Are you talking about a medical call? We stage for different things.
Sure. Let's leave it as a medical call.
Okay.
And there's some trouble at the scene. Do you just come right into that emergency call, or does fire stage until police clear the scene?
We stage and wait for police to give code 4.
Right. Code
Clear.
4 means all clear.
Safe, yep.
Right. So in a situation where there is trouble and the police are dealing with that trouble and they know they need a medical personnel to come into the scene,
Yeah,
medical won't come into the scene until it is called code 4, right?
correct.
All right. And you said in your experience you've been on numerous calls throughout the 2 years you've been a firefighter, right?
Correct.
And what would you agree that a fair number of those may have been calls that started out as call where the police responded first?
Correct.
So it's usually the police that are there first, they do some assessment, and they will call for medical.
Correct.
Have you ever been called to a scene where the police didn't call you? Meaning the police were present and they weren't the ones that called you?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. It's a little confusing. Police go to a scene, right? And whatever's happening at the scene, and they just don't ever call for medical, even though there's a medical situation.
Well, I wouldn't know because that means I wasn't called to it.
Precisely, right? So if you go to a scene, it's because you're responding to a call, right?
Correct.
And the reason that you're there is because the police call you.
If the police are on the scene first.
Right, if the police are on the scene first. And so in a situation where you see someone having a medical emergency, right, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that the police had already called for medics?
It would also be reasonable to assume that if the patient was cuffed
I'm going to ask you, I'm going to say objection non-responsive.
The answer will be certain. Wait for the question and then answer the question that is asked.
It's a yes or no question, ma'am. Is it reasonable to assume that if a patient is having a medical emergency and the police are present, that they have called for EMS?
your question is unclear because you don't know my job, so
Okay.
can't answer.
Sure. So let's take this scene, right? May 25th, 2020. You walk upon a scene, you see someone having a medical emergency, right? You did not call 911 to get the medics there, right?
Right.
Would it have been reasonable to assume that medics had already been called based on what you saw when you first arrived?
Yes.
And in fact, paramedics did respond, right? You saw the ambulance come up,
Yes, that's not their normal response time.
okay? And so you noticed there was some abnormal response time for medics.
Right, and I also noticed that that is precisely the kind of call that fire would respond to, and Station 17 is just a couple blocks away.
Okay. So do officers on scene decide, do we call for medic or fire?
I don't believe so. I believe that's dispatch. They call for medical
So if
Attention.
police call dispatch and they say EMS, we need EMS code 3, it's dispatch who decides, do we send medics or fire?
Well, it would be it would be fire with medics, not just fire ever. I don't know the answer to that.
Fair enough. But ultimately, medics did arrive, right?
Yeah, eventually.
And you have no frame of reference of when police called paramedics, do you?
No, but I know how long it takes for medics to get to calls typically, and I know how long it takes to drive 3 blocks in an emergency fire vehicle.
But that presumes that the fire vehicle was not on another call, right?
It would have been a different station the nearest 2 other stations would have been able to respond to that call in 3 minutes.
So if you first walked on scene at 8:26:29, that was what we just saw.
Okay.
8:26:29.
Okay.
And paramedics had been called at 8:21. That's an abnormal response time based on your experience.
What time did you say I arrived?
8:26:29.
And the medics arrived at what time?
The medics were called at 8:21. Code 3.
I don't believe that.
But again, you have no frame of reference, right? I mean, you've not seen any police reports, you've not looked at the CADs, you've not heard the 911 calls, you didn't listen to dispatch that night, did you?
That night? No, not that night.
Okay,
But that's totally abnormal.
all right.
And fire would have been added to that call because we go to calls like that all the time.
Right. And so it was abnormal, it would be completely and totally abnormal in your experience for it to take that long to get to the scene.
Absolutely.
All right. And are you familiar with the term load and go?
Yes.
And I believe you had a conversation with the BCA agents shortly after this incident, and you described what you observed as far as the paramedics doing was what's called a load and go, right?
Correct.
And that is essentially, as I understand it, paramedics arrive, something is amiss at the scene,
Mm-hmm.
so we put them into the ambulance and we move the ambulance to another.
A safe location to
Right.
address the needs.
And that's what you observed here, right?
Correct.
And it's because there were quite a few people, and those people were all fairly upset, right?
Correct.
And so, in your mind, as a paramedic with the experience that you have,
EMT.
or I'm sorry, as an EMT, I apologize, but as an EMT, you've done load and goes before,
We've done load and goes, yeah.
right? And so, the reason that the medics did not commence, at least as far as you understood, commence resuscitative efforts for Mr. Floyd was because they were doing a load and go, get him away.
Correct.
I want to object to that. No personal knowledge of this witness.
Overruled.
That's what you told the agents, right?
I don't remember exactly what I told the agents, but it looked like a load and go to me.
Okay. Now, in terms of your, again, personal experience, or excuse me, on that day, the paramedics drove off, and then at some other point, a couple minutes later, is when the fire truck arrives, right?
Right, and that's how I knew there was something wrong when requesting medical assistance.
Okay, because the fire department showed up at Cut Foods, and the ambulance had already left and gone to another location.
No, more because the fire, whether it's 17s or a different station, would have been able to respond to that call much sooner than medics were.
All right. So, I mean, you kind of formed that opinion on that day that there were some miscommunications between medics and fire and police.
Right, which, I mean, not to the fault of medics or fire. It's, we get a call and we go.
Okay.
So it was police and dispatch that miscommunication would have come in.
Okay. And again, that 5 or 6 minute delay is just unheard of in your experience.
Yes. Not by medics, but by fire specifically.
Are you trained as an EMT in the use of Narcan?
Yes, sir.
And can you explain what Narcan generally is?
It's an opioid reversal medication. We give it intranasally, but a lot of people on the street have a injectable form.
Kind of like an EpiPen almost, right?
Yeah, kind of.
You testified that the firehouse that you work at, you deal with a lot of overdose calls.
Correct.
And so you've had a lot of experience dealing with people who are overdosing
Correct.
from opiates or from other controlled substances.
Correct.
And you have seen or dealt with many people who come out of an opiate overdose because of Narcan.
Correct. If I didn't have Narcan though, we still give if we'll monitor a pulse and give compressions as necessary. I've never not had Narcan, but I would be able to give medical attention to somebody that had overdosed on an opioid and lost their pulse.
Okay, so let me ask you, is it fire department policy when you are going to a call of an overdose that police are also dispatched to that call?
I believe so, yeah.
And that is because when people are revived from that, they often become combative, right?
Not often.
I'm sorry,
Not often.
but it happens.
I've seen it happen.
Now I'm going to just kind of talk to you a little bit about your testimony about May 25th of 2020. You were out for a walk because it was your day off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Sorry. You're out for a walk, and you're walking you're walking westbound on 38th Street, and you see the lights, and you said it's not uncommon to see lights there.
In my neighborhood. Not on that corner, but in my neighborhood.
Okay.
Or in the city.
Right. Okay. And as you walked what would be the southeast corner of 38th in Chicago, you heard a woman yelling that they are killing him, right?
Right.
And so you did this kind of circle loop to visualize and see what was going on, right?
Right.
And at the point that you came on scene, Mr. Floyd was already on the ground, right?
Correct.
And Mr. Floyd, you saw what your memory told you was 4 police officers on him, right?
Correct.
But you now know that it was 3, right?
Correct.
And I think you made some reference about why you videotaped, because our memories are fallible,
Correct.
right? And again, a stressful situation can impact your memory, right?
Absolutely. That's why we're lucky it was videotaped.
Right. It's also fair to say that once you kind of came, you first talked to Officer Tao, and you said that you identified yourself as a Minneapolis firefighter, right?
Correct.
And Officer Tao asked you to step onto the curb, and you did that,
Correct.
right? And you would agree that when you first arrived on scene, your own personal, I'm just talking about you personally, your own personal demeanor was much more calm.
Correct.
And as you were there between 8:26 and 8:30, so in about those 4 minutes, you would agree that your own demeanor got louder and more frustrated and upset.
Frustrated, I'm not sure is the word I would use.
Angry?
More desperate.
And you called the officers a bitch, right?
Yeah. I got quite angry after Mr. Floyd was loaded into the ambulance, and there was no point in trying to reason with them anymore because they had just killed somebody.
So in terms of the time that you were there, you have no idea what those officers were doing on the side of the car, right?
The officers that I couldn't see from my vantage point, is that what you're asking?
Right. You
Right,
don't know what they were doing.
I couldn't see the two junior officers, except for maybe like their shoulders up.
And so it's fair to say you don't know what they were doing.
Correct.
You don't know what they were talking about.
The two of them, no.
And there was, again, you described a fairly large crowd, 10, 12 people that were all in that general area. And several people were yelling, right?
Right.
And some people were yelling louder than others, right?
Right.
And a lot of people were saying things like, get off of him, right?
Right.
And a lot of people, you yourself, were saying, I want to know what his pulse is,
Yep.
right? And some people were swearing.
Absolutely.
And would you describe other people's demeanors as upset or angry?
I don't know if you've seen anybody be killed, but it's upsetting.
The answer is
Yes, I was just going to object, Your Honor.
as argumentative and you can proceed.
I'm going to just ask you to answer my questions as I ask them to you, okay? You also talked about how when you first approached, you saw the complete and total body weight of all three officers on Mr. Floyd.
I never said all three officers. Their body weight was on him. The two in the back, their full body weight was seeming to be on him, but that's not something that would kill.
All right. But you testified that their
Okay, yes.
body weight.
Yes,
my
their
question
body
is,
weight, yes.
was on.
Just answer his questions if you
Okay.
like.
So just to be clear, for the record is clear, you testified.
Yes.
Let me finish my question.
Finish your question.
You testified that when you first arrived, you observed the weight of all three officers on Mr. Floyd. Yes or no?
Yes.
But again, once you were ushered or commanded or directed, whatever term you want to use, to the curb, you again, as far as the other two officers, you were not watching who had their weight, where, or when.
Correct. I could not see the other two officers. I could see them, and they were not talking much. I could see their faces.
A lot of people were yelling.
Right?
And again, you were not paying attention to what they were saying.
Just here and there.
So do you remember what the officers were talking about?
Oh, the officers? No, I have no idea. They weren't talking.
All right. You also testified that as you were observing Mr. Chauvin on George Floyd, that you formed the opinion that Mr. Chauvin's hand was in his pocket.
Correct.
And you described him as comfortable.
Correct.
You also testified that you observed what you thought to be fluid coming from Mr. Floyd's body, and you assigned that, or you believed that to be urine.
I considered that it was, and took that as a sign. that
Do
he
you
needed-
recall telling the agents that it was his urine?
I don't recall.
And you said that, you testified that your focus became really sort of zoomed in on trying to get the attention of the officers, right?
Not the attention so much as trying to reason with them and gain access to get medical attention.
And you testified that you believed that the other voices, the voices of other people, interfered with you getting their attention.
I was worried about it, but I know that Tao could hear me talking because he was responding to me directly.
Now, in terms of your the statement that you gave, you were interviewed by Agents Matthew Lund, and Agent James Ryerson. Do you recall those names?
No.
Do you dispute me if I'm
No.
telling? Okay. And would you dispute me if I told you that that interview took place on May 28th of 2020?
No.
And before coming into court, did you have an opportunity to review your statement at all?
I had the opportunity to, but I didn't.
Okay. You never read the transcript of your statement or
I
anything?
chose not to.
I just want to ask you a few questions. You said that Officer Tao at some point said, if you're really a firefighter, you should know better.
Correct.
Have you been to other scenes where people are trying to interfere with police officers doing their jobs?
No, not really. Not that I can recall.
Do you remember telling the agents that you believed that Officer Chauvin had his hands in his pocket?
Vaguely remember saying that.
Do you recall telling the agents that you were pretty certain the fluid was coming from Mr. Floyd's body, and that's what made you think he was dead?
I'm sure I said that. Pretty sure.
Do you recall describing the crowd as a heavy crowd?
No, I don't recall.
Would it refresh your recollection to review the transcript of your statement?
I don't want to.
Okay. Would you dispute me if I told you that you told the agents it was a heavy crowd?
No, I guess not.
Do you recall after paramedics took Mr. Floyd and then you had a conversation with the firefighters that arrived, how you described the physical appearance of Mr. Floyd?
I don't recall.
Do you recall telling them that he...
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Give us a improper form of cross-examination.
I don't want argument. What's your grounds?
Improper form of cross-examination.
Sustained. You may impeach if you wish.
All right. I know you don't want to look at your transcript, but may I approach the witness?
You may.
Ms. Hanson, in the show, counsel is page 8285, page 11 of 28. I'm just going to ask you to read the underlined portions in your head.
Yeah.
Does that refresh your recollection of your conversation?
Yeah.
Did you describe Mr. Floyd as a small, slim man?
Overruled.
Yeah, it appeared to, with 3 grown men on top of somebody, it appeared that he was small and frail.
Okay.
But I know that not to be
there's
true,
no question.
obviously. I was finishing my answer.
Members of the jury, we're going to quit for the day. Please go back into the courtroom. Counsel remain. Witness remain. Be seated. We are outside the hearing of the jury. Ms. Hanson, I'm advising you, do not argue with counsel, and specifically, do not argue with the court.
Is the cameras off? Are the cameras off?
No, they are not. We are on the record.
Okay.
You will not argue with the court. You will not argue with counsel.
Mm-hmm.
They have the right to ask questions. Your job is to answer them.
I was finishing my answer.
I will determine when your answer is done.
Okay, well,
And so, do not argue with the court. Do not argue with counsel. Answer the questions. Do not volunteer information that is not requested. The attorneys for the state have redirect. They can ask you questions if they think that certain things were left out.
okay.
It is counsel's prerogative to ask you leading questions and for you to answer those and not volunteer additional information.
Okay.
Are we clear on this?
We're clear.
Thank you. Come back tomorrow at 9:30.
All right. Good night.
Do we have the person with the cell phone? Could we arrange to have that person come down? Somebody from the state to have access to that person? If you could have that person come in.